I'm the warm-up act today, so I'm here to give you a little bit of context behind why we were interested in sustainable phosphorus management. What is our context here? I don't know what to describe myself as, a frustrated restoration ecologist maybe. So this is my happy place, looking at lakes. This is Loch Leven, which is in the east centre of Scotland. It's got a long and well documented history of phosphorus pollution and eutrophication at the site, which resulted in fairly significant socio-economic impacts and a loss of biodiversity and all of the symptoms that we're all familiar with respect to phosphorus pollution. And this is my introduction to sustainable phosphorus management. I did my PhD here whilst I was at University of St Andrews back in 2003. And the story here is one that's of global relevance, certainly in my opinion, where through coordinated action in the catchment across sectors, a sustainable phosphorus management plan was put into place, which resulted in investment from public and private partners, which reduced the phosphorus load by about 60% in the 1990s. There's then a whole series of exciting biogeochemical events that was documented, and you can see my eyes light up. So that's really where my core interests are in terms of phosphorus cycling within lakes. But recovery was delayed. To cut a long story short, recovery was delayed by internal loading, and then in about 2007 we saw biodiversity start to come back with a boom, which encouraged people back to the loch. We saw ecotourism increase, we saw habitat restoration investments increase, more jobs, more economic growth in this area of Scotland, which is fairly socially deprived in part of the catchment. So I think this story is a real success story in terms of sustainable management and what can be achieved, but also in terms of why we need it. And that's really where I come from when I'm thinking about sustainable phosphorus management. I think we're all fairly well aware of the value of freshwater ecosystems. Lakes and rivers globally, the estimate is about $2.5 trillion per year. Obviously, there's large uncertainties associated with this. And there's a risk that if we continue to use nutrients in an unsustainable way, that we will reduce this value that society is fully dependent upon. And so it's important that we understand how we can manage our catchments and our water bodies more effectively to support a growing population. It's there for, I said I was a frustrated restoration ecologist that I am, and it's frustrating when you travel around and you see these practices, you see this evidence in the environments that we visit. The symptoms of certainly phosphorus and nitrogen pollution of our aquatic ecosystems is fairly drastic, and there's, as mentioned earlier, there's a lot of activity that's focused on ecosystem restoration, that's supported by UNEA resolutions and various other international bodies that really drives this forward. And of course, climate change is upon us. Climate change times phosphorus equals many dollars, and that's really a slant on the cost of dealing with eutrophication. And so we conducted a study recently in the UK for the Committee on Climate Change, where we assessed the cost of responding to algal blooms, which currently is about £173 million a year. And as a result of warming by 2080, that could almost double, more than double, in fact, in terms of these projections. And so what can we do about this in this uncertain future? Well, phosphorus and nutrients tend to be what people consider first as a mitigation measure. Reduce the nutrient concentrations further, set more stringent targets to try and alleviate the effects of future stressors. And to put this into context, in England and Wales alone, there was over £2 billion spent on reducing phosphorus discharges from sewage, which achieved about a 60% reduction over the last few decades. And I think what's important from an ecologist perspective is that even though that's happened, we still haven't reached the point at which our lakes will respond. So in England and Wales, we still have about 75% of our lakes that fail phosphorus targets. So even though there's been big savings or big reductions in the load from significant sources, the lakes still feel the strain. And I think those of us who are working in this field know that as we come down the stressor gradient, as we try and polish our phosphorus load to lower and lower concentrations that are ecologically meaningful, the cost relative per unit phosphorus goes up. And in response to that, it's been particularly challenging to manage catchments. I'm sure you're all aware of the term legacy phosphorus from Sharpley's papers and others. Well, legacy phosphorus in lakes is a big issue, and the lake restoration community have been working hard to try and find ways to speed up recovery or to force recovery when catchment loading can't necessarily be managed, and that's a reality for many lake catchment managers around the world. And these techniques, termed geoengineering techniques in lakes, is where we add amendments, we add chemical amendments to lakes to soak up phosphorus. To produce, basically to relieve the symptoms of eutrophication in those systems. And there's a whole group of people asking the question, is this sustainable? Can we do this long term? Clearly the answer, logically is no, it's not sustainable to do it this way, even though it is quite an effective measure. When we look at the situation across the world in terms of the community of practice, the situation becomes quite stark. This is a survey of the global lake restoration community in practice, which was conducted by the World Water Quality Alliance Ecosystems Workstream, which I co-chair with Ken Irvin at IHE Delft. And we asked the practitioners across the world to basically tell us about their story of lake restoration. How difficult is it? Can you achieve it? What are the main pressures that you're focused on? And it probably won't come as a surprise that the main pressure across over 63 countries, which represents 200 individual lake case studies, was that the main pressures that they're concerned with on a day-to-day basis is nutrients and climate change. Hydrological alterations are also in there. And so the story of restoration, when we asked, well, can you do this effectively? What are the barriers? The main barriers that were reported back to us across all sort of GDP classes of countries was governance, including across in Europe in terms of the WFD, and in the US in terms of the Clean Water Act. Feedback was, the governance systems that we have in place are not necessarily fit for purpose and they need to change. There was loads of other reasons. There's a whole complex story, obviously, across each country, and this has been written up by our colleagues at the Joint Research Centre in Europe on that just now. So my job on OPF, the first job was how did we end up here? And please bear with me, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the history of phosphorus and its use in the food system and pollution, but normally we would get an introduction to Henning Brand, and yeah, I did delve into the Latin papers to find out the evidence behind Henning Brand, and it's there, it's interesting. Please read up on it if you have a few weeks to delve into it. But the story I wanted to tell you was about Sir John Murray, and I think this is a really interesting story about the foundations of the global phosphorus challenge. I've got challenger there. Excuse me for that fairly weak joke. For those of you who don't know John Murray, he became the chief scientist of the Challenger expedition, which of course was a scientific expedition to circumnavigate through the Southern Ocean. Collected a lot of scientific information, and he was responsible for publishing the report that came out of that, one of his first seminal works. But his second seminal work was on limnology, so he was clearly a keen oceanographer, but also a keen limnologist. And he conducted the first comprehensive study of a national population of lakes in Scotland in 1897 to 1909. So why is this important to the phosphorus story? Well, he used the evidence that he gained from the Challenger expedition, which included access to phosphorus rock deposits across various different islands in the Southern Ocean. He identified that Christmas Island had a very rich deposit of guano-formed phosphate rock, and he influenced the British government to annex the island and formed his own Christmas Island Phosphate Company. So around about the same time as he was conducting his first limnological surveys of the lakes, his company produced about 1 million tons of phosphate rock, which represented about 2% of the global production at that time. And the money that he made from the proceeds of that work, he used to finance some of his scientific expeditions. And when you look at in detail, and I encourage you to do so, the links are at the bottom of the page here, all of this has been digitized. When you look at the stories that he created for these lakes, you can see that he's starting to see the first evidence of anthropogenic nutrient pollution across these lakes. And so it's a very interesting story about industry fueling science and science feeding back to industry, right at the beginning of the sort of problem of fertilizer use impacting on water quality. We can fast forward. Thankfully, colleagues, and perhaps some of them are in the room, have done a fantastic job of documenting the history of phosphorus and phosphate rock extraction, etc. And what I can tell you is that along this hockey stick, where phosphorus has been used to drive the global food system, the scientific community in the freshwater sector, so to speak, we're putting out calls for action to say, just be aware, we're seeing impacts of unsustainable phosphorus and nitrogen use, but mainly we're focusing on phosphorus in freshwater during that time. We're seeing evidence of unsustainable phosphorus use that are impacting on water quality, and be aware of that. And there were some fairly significant calls for action in the States in around the 40s. And the one that really struck me was, I think, perhaps the precursor to the planetary boundaries work by Werner Stum, where he mentions that by mining phosphorus in progressively increasing quantities, man disturbs the ecological balance and creates undesirable conditions in inland waters, estuaries, and coastal marine waters. And I think that's probably a story that rings true to many of us today. And so with these calls for action, why hasn't there been change already? And that was really one of our main questions. We can expand on this through to recent times. There's been maybe a ramping up in terms of the impact of the calls for action, where we had Jeremy Grantham from the Grantham Foundation publishing in Nature in 2012. He was challenging the scientific community: be persuasive, be brave, and be arrested if necessary. I'm sure, well, certainly I don't want to be arrested, but he was saying, scientists have to make this call, have to present the case for more sustainable phosphorus use. He was balancing this on peak phosphorus and population growth. Now, of course, we know that the discussion on peak phosphorus has progressed significantly, as was recognised by the Planetary Boundary for P paper by Steve Carpenter and Alina Bennett. They made much of the same calls, trying to demonstrate that we'd crossed the planetary boundary for eutrophication in fresh waters, and that we look to be approaching, at least in the future, the planetary boundaries for anoxic events in coastal zones and the depletion of phosphate rock reserves. So with all of these calls for action, it's logical for us to ask, well, why is there no groundswell of activity in terms of global phosphorus resolution or intergovernmental action in this area? When we look in the future, we can see that phosphorus demand in the agricultural sector is predicted to double again by 2050. Similarly, phosphorus losses from wastewater projections of similar percentage increases. So there's evidence in the literature for the need for an urgent change, an urgent response to this. Which really brings us to our Phosphorus Future, and Will was challenged to try and work with you guys and who are in the audience and others to try and pull together a group of authors which really represented the transdisciplinary approach that's required to get into this phosphorus, the global phosphorus challenge. And I think it was important from my perspective that we lay out, what was our ambition in OPF, and that was to provide the scientific evidence to inform discussion on addressing the global phosphorus challenge. It wasn't to provide a prescription, it was simply to give the scientific community the opportunity to come together and to try and synthesize their work in a convincing and new way, but ultimately to try and inform dialogue on this topic. And just to finish off, just some key outputs for me. This first one was Will's primer paper for OPF, where he reviews the various papers that have quantified the fluxes and flows and loss points of the global phosphorus cycle. The one thing that stood out for me in Will's work on this was where he basically summarized, he mapped out all of the global actors that might be responsible to come together and think about, the best approach, a coordinated approach to try and address or to try and improve global phosphorus sustainability. There's a lot of them there, right? So it's going to be a challenge, I think, to try and pull that together. How do we do that? That's one of the questions. And then just recently there's been some really exciting outputs. That the OPF experience for me has been one of collaboration and new ideas and developing our awareness of the problem. And so these are just some examples. So Jen Metzen has turned her chapter into a paper and advanced it very significantly. It's a very exciting paper in one of the Nature family journals on sustainability, looking at net zero phosphorus for cities, recognizing that the urban system is the engine room that drives unsustainable practices through the food system. We've got work by Dana Cardell and Paul Withers, which is looking at the UK Sustainable Phosphorus Strategy. And what was particularly exciting for me in this refocus project that they led was the way that they pulled in the stakeholders, and they worked with them together to try to develop new or basically future scenarios of sustainability through that. That should be published. Sorry, the first one should be published within the next couple of weeks, and the second one. The next is the work that was ongoing, looking at phosphorus demand for electric vehicles. And I think Linda's presenting on this work in the conference, so I won't steal her thunder, but basically it's important for us to try and identify new demands and emerging demands, and obviously the electric vehicle battery production was one that was covered in these papers. And then finally, working with the food industry to try and encourage innovation in their role as in driving sustainable nutrient use, phosphorus and nitrogen. But this article focusing on phosphorus in the New Food magazine. And I'm often asked the question, well, you've got all of this evidence, and OPS 300, 400 odd pages, it's huge. You've got all of this evidence. Why is nothing changing? And it's perhaps because some of the evidence that's been presented isn't of the sort of utmost policy relevance, or doesn't have an urgent policy relevance when it's presented. So the timing is clearly critical, but also the narrative is important. And what's been coming through from John Downing and his collaborators and many others now, there's a groundswell of literature on this at the moment, is the role of phosphorus in driving greenhouse gas emissions from inland waters. Some key statistics from my favourite papers on this: greenhouse gas emissions from lakes are significant, in the order of 20% of current global fossil fuel emissions. Methane emissions from lakes projected to increase 20 by 100% by 2050. Following the current unsustainable nutrient management eutrophication path, and then some estimates of the social cost, global present value social costs for methane between 2015 and 2050 at 7.5 to 81 trillion. So I think this is a fairly convincing narrative, and certainly in terms of things like the IPCC and COP27, it's really exciting. Will has actually been invited to give a short presentation at the COP meeting that's coming up. So I think there's a movement here, and there's things starting to happen in this sphere. And the data I've got on here is from a UK initiative. We think it's the first global initiative of monitoring greenhouse gas emissions at the national scale across inland waters. And if you want to know more about that project, please go to the link. And so OPF has worked with our partners to try and raise awareness. This is just one example of our work with lucky enough to work with the United Nations Environment Programme on some of these key concerns that are coming through. But we're still not quite feeling that groundswell of movement in terms of the international policy community. Why is that? Well, we have experience in this field. My colleague Mark Sutton is heavily involved in the Global Sustainable Nitrogen Management Initiative, and that is backed up by 2 UNEA resolutions now. And so it's logical for us to ask, is this the right approach for phosphorus? And then if not, why not? Let's have a discussion about it. When we look at the UNEA approach, United Nations Environment Assembly approach, we can see that there's lots of, at least a handful of UNEA resolutions coming through that are relevant to phosphorus, that phosphorus has a part in. In fact, phosphorus is named in the Sustainable Nitrogen Management in one of the lines in there, if you want to have a look. And so, is the job here to have a resolution for phosphorus on its own? Do we need that? Who's going to propose it? What country is going to champion it? Do we not need it? Is it sufficient that we embed phosphorus across the implementation plans and the existing policies that are there already? And that's a question that, I don't have the answer to that question. These are questions that are in my head at the end of OPF. And so, where is the driver for change? What are the barriers to change? How do we overcome these barriers? So with that, I'll hand over to Will, who'll give you a bit more detail on the OPF project. And then hopefully we can come back and have a chat with you all at the end.
Great. Okay, so I'm Will Brownlee. I've been working with Brian for over a decade now. He was my PhD supervisor when I was a wee nipper, and now we've moved on to this sort of global situation with phosphorus. So the birth of the phosphorus, a birth of OPF, which Brian has sort of introduced there. Actually, the first sort of thing that really came at the beginning of the project was the Helsinki Declaration. So this was our attempt to actually write a resolution, a UNEA resolution, not deliver the resolution, but have a go at saying, let's put a resolution together, which is, a couple of pages of A4, really just outlining what we feel is important with the phosphorus global challenge. And we actually released that, launched that at the ESPC meeting in Helsinki. That's the European Sustainable Phosphorus Conference. But shortly after that, I think a month after that, we went across to the Sustainable Phosphorus Summit, which was in Brazil, which was the last one, and put together a workshop with UNEP, with our UNEP colleagues, to talk more about the Helsinki Declaration. So this is sort of really an online petition, and within a year we had 500 scientists that had signed the declaration calling for action. So that sort of ran at the same time as the beginnings of the the OPF project. And a recap of the project aims were that we wanted to raise awareness of the issues, we wanted to provide scientific evidence to support policy development, and we wanted to contribute to consensus development. So the OPF report, it ran for a lot longer than we expected. We thought it was going to be a 2-year project. It turned out that this was a much more difficult task than we anticipated. It ended up being 4 years and a lot of late nights. It was developed by 40 authors. 21 countries were involved in the end, and it was underpinned by over 2,000 peer-reviewed publications that spanned over 300 years of research. And then we went through maybe, I think, a year and a half actually of reviews with industry, with academic reviewers. So this is a highly reviewed document, which we feel is pretty reliable. And the web link is just down there. So some of the different, I mean, this is not obviously all of the institutions, but just a little idea of who was involved. You can see the University of Arkansas down there. And we had a foreword by the co-chair of the UNEP International Resource Panel, Janice there, and the preface was, the preface was from the UNEP's Global Partnership on Nutrient Management. So they were very involved in the process. We had 9 chapters in all, but we sort of based it around these OPF pillars we discussed throughout the document, which are really chapters 2 to 8. And this is phosphorus access. We feel that's important for phosphorus sustainability. Food security, obviously, agriculture and food production, water quality, phosphorus recycling, phosphorus recovery, and then consumption. So I'm just going to do a very quick run through really what was inside the OPF report, what's been summarized in the documents I hope you all have on your desks. Importantly, what we tried to do with the whole document was to ensure this, through those chapters, through those pillars, the same structure, which was to provide a background on the subject and then provide the challenges, and then also then provide a solution to each challenge. So it was a very solution-based document. So we started off with this chapter 2, which was phosphorus reserves and resources and uses. Some of the findings from that, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of, but some of the challenges at least, is that the 85% of the known global reserves are in very few countries, in 5 countries. And you can see this is dominated by Morocco and Western Sahara. But actually, when you look at production of phosphorus, it's dominated really by 4 countries, which is China, mainly China, Morocco and Western Sahara, the USA, and Russia. So you can see that, as you know, when we were writing this report, this was pre-Ukraine-Russia conflict, and that situation has changed slightly now. So we've already sort of indicated that this geopolitics can impact phosphorus trade, and this can include things like taxes and trades and tariff deals, political instabilities in producing countries, and also conflicts over who owns phosphates, which is an issue which is ongoing in Western Sahara. This is not included completely in the document because, as I sort of said, this wasn't happening while we were doing the document. But important to raise at the moment that these phosphorus commodity price spikes really do impact our food systems. The 2008 price spike, which you can see in the graph, raised prices of different phosphorus commodities by up to 800%. A spike at the moment is doing the same, up to about 400%. And it's impacting food security. The causes of these price spikes are complex. It's to do with market supply and demand dynamics, instability in energy prices. If you see that graph, the peaks match very closely to energy prices, and influence on geopolitics, on export quotas. So at the moment, restrictions on phosphorus impact are impacting 20% of global fertilizer trade, and threatening more than 50% of the fertilizer supply for 24 countries. So that's a major impact. And you can see in this graph some of these key events that are happening here. You know, this is the outbreak of COVID at January 20. You can see now that China halted fertilizer exports in October. Turkey did the same in November. Russia has done the same in March. So these are all having impacts on how we access our phosphorus. But we move more on to in the later chapters, or the middle section of OPF, into transforming food systems, and opportunities for better phosphorus use in agriculture. And I'm sure, as all of you are very aware, food security, world security is very dependent on having access to phosphorus fertilizers. At the moment, 1 in 7 farmers cannot afford enough fertilizer to feed their communities. In fact, that's quite an old figure. We don't have anything updated on that. And I wonder if that situation is worse now in parts of Africa. Indeed, in Africa, fertilizers can cost 2 to 6 times more than in Europe or the States, or even in Asia. And that's scary when you think of, by the end of the century, 4 in every 10 people, and nearly half of all the children on the planet will be African. So then we have a look at some of the opportunities, and there are many opportunities for improving phosphorus efficiency in agriculture, and I'm sure you all know most of these, but to overgo them again, we can provide farmers with better support to increase phosphorus use efficiency. We can implement crop management measures to improve plant uptake. We can phosphorus. We can optimize our animal diets to lower phosphorus excretion and improve our manure management. We can increase phosphorus recycling from manures and residue streams, and we can develop those important integrated policies and phosphorus use efficiency targets across scales. Then we step on to phosphorus and water security and water quality. This chapter was led by Brian here. And you can see, and Penny Jones and Louise Heathwaite as well. And you can see that water security is a major issue. Widespread harmful algal blooms, a risk to human and environmental health. It's driving rapid freshwater biodiversity loss, toxic waters, fish kills. And that phosphorus pollution is long lasting. You know, it's more than decades to try and restore the impacts of this phosphorus pollution because of those legacy stores and phosphorus sediments. And this is not an issue that is only in low economically developed countries. This is something that's impacting us all. You know, it's the greatest cause of freshwater quality on the planet. And to halt those phosphorus losses, we estimated in the report it would cost between 250 to 400 billion annually. So this represents a major challenge and a significant environmental burden for future generations as well. You know, this is some newspaper cuttings I took quickly before the talk today from 2014, where the Toledo water crisis, 500,000 people without safe drinking water as those toxins contaminate Ohio city supplies. And phosphorus pollution, which Brian covered in detail there, is contributing to climate change. In this century, as a result of increased primary production in water bodies driven by phosphorus enrichment, emissions of methane from lakes may reach 30% of current CO2 equivalent emissions from fossil fuels. So climate change is impacting algal blooms, and algal blooms is impacting climate change. Then we get on to the sort of end of the report, where we're really concentrating on those opportunities to recycle phosphorus from organic materials like manures. And then we look at recovering phosphorus from residue streams. This was actually led by Ludwig Herman, who's in the audience there, I believe. And then we talk about consumption, which was led by Jen, and her paper's just come out, which reports some of the findings of that chapter. Importantly, we need to treat waste streams as valuable nutrient resources. So we need a paradigm shift there. We need to optimize our spatial integration of arable and livestock agriculture systems. And we need to develop those policies and regulations that support phosphorus recycling. We actually mention a goal in the report. Would be good that maybe fertilizer companies would contain, or fertilizers would contain, a minimum of 20% recycled phosphorus by 2030. And that would set a real benchmark that demonstrates the fertilizer industry's commitment to phosphorus sustainability. But also, we all have a role to play. We need to think about how we consume our products that have high phosphorus footprints. You know, we can reduce food losses throughout food production, and that means ourselves, but also in our big institutions, in our hospitals, in our hotels. And we need to make being sustainable easy and rewarding for consumers, and we need to develop those important policies and support mechanisms to help consumers lead sustainable phosphorus lifestyles. So the last chapter pulls all this together into, we have all the knowledge available, but what do we do next? And what we found throughout this report was the solutions to the challenges are well known. We have strategies for improving circularity, and I've just picked a couple of the papers here. For Brazil, we have frameworks. For the EU, we have the frameworks for USA, for China, for UK, and there's more papers I haven't listed there with different areas. And a common goal in all of these papers is to improve phosphorus use in agriculture. But we sort of argue that we need a more integrated approach is needed to improve phosphorus stewardship throughout the food production and consumption chain and across whole regions and globally. And indeed, when you look at, just as an example, some of these transboundary impacts of phosphorus use, this is a map produced by the IFA that shows some of the phosphorus flows between different countries. You can see that this isn't a job for nations to be working on their own in isolation. This is something that needs international cooperation. So we distilled the whole report into these 10 key actions. I'm just going to read them out as verbatim, and they're also in the report that you have on your desks. Use more recycled phosphorus in fertilizer. We have to do this. We have to optimize our phosphorus inputs to agricultural soils. We need to feed the crops, not the soils. We need to optimize our animal diets to reduce phosphorus excretion. We need to increase appropriate application of manures and other phosphorus-rich residues. We need to improve reporting and assessments of the impacts on freshwater and coastal ecosystems. We need to implement integrated approaches to restore and protect rivers, lakes, and coastlines. We need to implement national to global strategies to increase recycling of phosphorus from wastes. We need to ensure sufficient access to affordable phosphorus fertilizers for all farmers, and we need to promote a global shift to healthy and nutritious diets with low phosphorus footprints. And finally, we need to reduce the phosphorus lost as food waste. How are we going to get there? Well, we sort of identified 4 major steps. Brian's already mentioned some of these. We need an international framework. This is a big project to identify and consolidate knowledge and identify the opportunities for large-scale transition. This is not dissimilar to the International Nitrogen Management System project, which is going on at the moment, led by Mark Sutton, our colleague, but we would like to see one for phosphorus. And we need a global commitment. This is something along the lines of a UNEA resolution. We also would like to see intergovernmental coordination. This is really a mechanism that can bring all the different conventions together and work out how they can address phosphorus across their different agendas and their different mandates. And finally, we need a shared goal for improvement. And I'm going to talk a tiny bit about that before I finish. So what is an interconvention phosphorus coordination mechanism? Well, this is one of those. This is where we pull in all the different mandates and initiatives that are currently running on different positions or different parts of the phosphorus cycle. For example, food security, fertilizer contaminants, resource security, equitable trade, water security, residue management. And we find those organizations that are dealing with those aspects of the phosphorus challenge. And we have one central unit that can speak to all those different bodies and say, this is how you can address phosphorus within your sectors, but also this is how you can work together to address the phosphorus challenge together. So an example of this may be, for example, in Switzerland and Germany, where they are really pushing for phosphorus recovery from sewage and sanitation. That's great, but in isolation, it's not that useful. You need also to have agriculture to have a mandate to accept that recovered phosphorus. And then this group would then report to UNEP, the Committee of Permanent Representatives. This could go through to the UN Environment Assembly and all the way up to the UN General Assembly, and that would feed out to real actions by countries to do something about phosphorus sustainability. Then the shared goal for improvement, well, we came up with this idea of OPF 50-50-50 goal, a 50% reduction in global phosphorus pollution and 50% increase in the recycling of phosphorus lost in waste by 2050. And we went through some ideas of what would happen if we actually did that. Well, we worked out that that would return 8.5 million tons of recycled phosphorus to farms each year. That's enough to sustain the food system that could provide enough food for 4 times our population. If we did the OPF 50-50 goal, we'd also save the global farming community 20 billion in annual fertilizer costs needed to replace those losses. If we did the 50-50 goal, we could cut pollution impacts, which would cost US 300 billion to fix. And it would help build jobs in the green and circular economies. It would support a transition to a sustainable phosphorus future and post-COVID green recovery. And it would protect against those fluctuations in future phosphorus fertilizer price spikes. At the time of writing this, we weren't aware that one was just around the corner, and we're now currently experiencing that. And to make OPF really easily accessible to everyone, to raise awareness, we made sure that the report was also provided, each chapter, not only as a chapter, but also as a visual summary, which you can find on the website. This is a scrolling story, which means that you can access the keynotes of the chapter in 15 minutes. And then we distill this down further to an explainer video, which you can watch in 1 minute, 1.5 minutes or so. So you can basically get the entire document by spending 10 or 15 minutes watching videos. You'll get the main idea. And that was important for us to get the policymakers involved. We also put an animated video together. This is really more for the public, which you can also watch. And that's really about what can consumers do to get involved in the phosphorus global phosphorus challenge. So all of this was released on the 9th of June. It's at that web link. Please go and find it. It works on your phones as well. Please send it to all your friends and your families and your loved ones. And we did that. We sent it to everyone we knew. And as a result, a month later, we had 400 newspaper reports online all around the planet talking about phosphorus. So this was a great output and a great ending to a very long story on our Phosphorus Future report. So I'll finish there, and I'll hand over to you guys to ask any questions. Thank you.
Yep. All right, great. So let's thank our speakers. Hopefully you're able to hear applause.
I can see applause, and that's enough for both of us. So we're happy. Thank you very much, everyone.
All of us here, just wave to them as like a thank you.
So Brian is just here, so I'll hand the microphone over to Brian if there's any questions that he can answer better than I.
Yep. You'll have to balance that for sure. I'll start us out with a question, but Matt has the microphone here, so go ahead and raise your hand if you want to be the first one to have the in-room mic. But I'll start us off. Will, I think it was you that presented the slide with a bunch of lines across the world talking about the need for international cooperation. I think maybe the lines were the phosphorus distribution network. But I wonder how you feel about, and maybe this is a controversial question, but the energy required for phosphorus transport and for food transport, and how that's balanced with ideas like regenerative farming and farm to fork types of initiatives, and sort of the global versus local scale aspects of this.
Well, I mean, actually, the person who should really answer this question, I don't think she's at the conference, is Helena Kralulatu. I'm pronouncing that very, very bad. She's a colleague from Finland. She wrote a great paper on this, which I can provide later, which discusses about how we can actually use those logistics to transport recycled phosphorus. And it works out actually more, I think it's more energy, it's less energy intensive to do that. So those routes you're looking at on that map, if the slide is still up, if you imagine returning all those boats with recycled phosphorus from our use of abattoir wastes and our sanitation, what a different story that might be in terms of how a reduction in mined phosphorus we would need. In terms of the energy costs, I mean, the energy of mining phosphorus and turning and making fertilizers is enormous. So all of those solutions that we've written there, that they're all about reducing our need for new inputs to the phosphorus cycle, and as you do that, that also reduces your energy costs in many ways, I believe. Maybe ask Ludwig about exactly the energy needs to to recover phosphorus in comparison to get phosphorus from mined rock and transport it across to different places, then to turn it into fertilizer. But I think you'll find actually recovering phosphorus is probably a lot more energy conservative, than mining it from rock.
Thank you, Will. There's a question in the room now.
I'd like to know if you can comment more on.
Oh.
I can hear you.
Yep. Comment more on optimizing animal diets, and particularly I'm interested in feeding phytase to monogastric animals. And also if you can comment if there's going to be changes on the ban of feeding meat and bone meal to monogastrics or to animals, especially in Europe in the future.
What we were looking at was some of the existing evidence on that in that chapter, actually, which was led by myself and Ruben Sacrabani from Cranfield. And what we found was actually a lot of the existing guidance on how much phosphorus should be in monogastric diets and livestock diets in general was really out of date. And you could find that feeding the phosphorus needs to feed poultry, lamb, cattle and pigs. Good research to say you can feed them a lot less and still have excellent production, same milk output, same meat production. So I think in general the phosphorus guidelines, certainly for the US, China and some of the EU, are outdated and we don't need to feed so much phosphorus. I think things like phytase enzymes have a real benefit, but I think this has been long known. I think phytase are pretty standard, especially in the EU, for allowing monogastrics to access that phosphorus that they would have excreted. In terms of banning or legislation on feeding bone meal to livestock, I'm not an expert on that. You'd have to ask somebody else. But I certainly come from a country where we were very nervous about this because of the mad cow disease outbreak, and that legacy of concern about feeding bone meal. It's still there, and whether that's right or wrong, I'm probably not the best person to answer. They may have to speak to the veterinary guys to speak about that.
Okay. Yep.
Thanks. This was a great presentation. I noticed a strong emphasis on international cooperation. I'm wondering if there's been discussion about interlocal cooperation. One of the things we've seen, particularly in climate change, is focusing down to a domestic regional scale in federal systems as a successful measure to create sort of laboratories of innovation to try and identify where regions that are working local regions that are working particularly well together, not just thinking about sort of the nation as a unified actor.
I feel like because I've got the microphone, I'm answering all the questions. So Brian, just grab it off me if you want to add anything in. That's a really good question, and it's really important too. We certainly found that in the last chapter in Jen's work, and certainly she's written about that in this new paper, which was only accepted 2 days ago, so it should be out soon. But this idea of net zero cities is really looking at that importance of these mini local cycles, and effectively really saying, if you, and actually that's one of the outputs from chapter 6 there, which we mentioned there, is how do we integrate those local farming practices with your hotspots of phosphorus accumulation in your cities. So we're pushing all of this phosphorus-laden food into your city and collecting phosphorus in the sanitation and the waste there. How can we move that to peri-urban agriculture? And in the paper we mentioned earlier, where you have those mega cities where you're collecting so much phosphorus in those cities, is it possible to then start exporting that as a commodity? A bit like full circle back to the beginning of Brian's talk, where we talked about the trade in phosphorus guano, which really started that whole sort of phosphorus story there. But the local partnerships between organic farmers as well, which is very important, where organic farmers need fertilizer, so they join partnership with livestock farmers local to support their phosphorus needs. I mean, these are the kind of solutions, the sort of grassroots solutions, which are going to get us to solving the phosphorus sustainability challenge. I think without them, without local community action, we won't get there. Brian, do you want to add anything?
Over here in the room, Kaushik.
Good morning. Excellent presentation, and congratulations to both of you. I was thinking about the two sides you presented. One of you was were looking at the non-provision of ecosystem services, how that is being affected by phosphorus use, and also brought out the need for a P laws or kind of policy. The next speaker spoke about Africa and brought out the issue that fertilizer P is limiting there, and that is affecting the food security. So while wondering about what would a P policy look like, I was thinking that do you see that countries which have large P reserves in their soils, which are creating environmental challenges, could take a policy for us that for the next 3 years we are not going to use phosphorus and try to use the legacy one, but add a bit of philanthropic twist to it and say that we will buy the phosphorus but send it to a country like Malawi or Mali, for that matter, one of those African countries which desperately need these fertilizers. In that way, do you think we can address both the challenges? Is that something we could go forward?
I think that's a good idea in practice. I think it'd be complicated. I mean, certainly complicated to convince our government at the moment that we're that's it. But I think, to be honest, we're almost being forced into this situation at the moment by the rising prices in fertilizer anyway. In part of that is that, you know, some of these richer countries that are pouring too much phosphorus on their soils are suddenly saying we can't afford it. We'll just use our legacy supplies, you know, to run our agricultural systems for the foreseeable future. In terms of convincing those countries to then purchase the phosphorus for you know, countries where they desperately need phosphorus, it would get my vote, and I'm sure it would get Brian's vote. I'm not sure how we move on that. I think with the idea of the 50-50-50 goal, we worded it very carefully that it is relevant to countries that are using too much phosphorus and also countries that are in need of phosphorus. Brian, do you want to add anything? Yeah, I'm going to pop over here.
If only so that you don't have to listen to Will all the time. I mean, I thought that was a great idea, and I think that's what this is all about, is trying to have people come up with innovative potential solutions for this stuff. The point that you made there, on which really struck to me, was on the need for a halt, for urgency. If we could stop, you know, focusing on use of mined phosphorus for 3 years or so, and focus away onto other sources and target it to countries that need it. I mean, you presented your question first of all talking about sort of water security issues, and from my context, there are countries in the world where you know, water quality is being degraded fairly rapidly, and there is an urgent need for those countries to try and look at that. Otherwise, they will end up in the situation that certainly the UK has found itself in, where you know, is it too late? Have you pushed the system too far? So thinking about urgency for me is key, and that is clearly you know, country specific. So I mean, the example I would give you is the Chilean Lake District at the moment, where you know, it's a massive ecotourism resource for Chile. It's also the site of fairly heavy aquaculture, and it's starting to experience the sort of, I guess you might call it, early onset of eutrophication, but the potential economic impacts of you know, heavy degradation of the Chilean Lake District nationally is pretty extreme. So they're looking at it in detail, understandably. So yeah, that's just my take on it. Thanks, Will, for giving me the mic.
Okay, so we've got one more question in the room from Jim, but we will make time for a question from a student or postdoc after that. I appeal to you, if you're on the edge of asking a question, just do it, raise your hand. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Will. I think I'm looking at you. Is that right?
Will's
Jim
in the
Elster
background.
here.
Yeah.
Good to see you. So we're here at the Sustainable Phosphorus Summit, and we've been talking a lot about nitrogen, a fair amount. We got Nancy Rabelais in the room, talked about nitrogen as a part of phosphorus, as it's connected to phosphorus. So, and you showed a picture of Mark Sutton. I think a couple of weeks ago, there was a nitrogen sustainability workshop that was held somewhere. What will it take? How do we do it? How do we join forces? I think that our impact would be amplified, multiplied, if we were able to leverage our mutual networks and connections with the nitrogen side of things. So do you have any strategy suggestions about the next steps to get, should we be getting closer with nitrogen? The next sustainable nutrient summit perhaps should be taking place rather than the sustainable phosphorus summit. That's my radical concept of the day.
Yeah, it's Brian here answering that question. First of all, Jim, that's a question that certainly Mark and I have wrestled with over the years, and I'm sure everyone has their own opinion on whether nitrogen and phosphorus could be considered together. There's clearly good biophysical reasons to consider them together, and I'm assuming that's what, I mean, Nancy's work's brilliant, right? Her papers are fantastic. So putting it into the scope of the global cycle in the way that work does is really powerful for us. So the biophysical reason is there and sold in my head. You have to consider them together, and carbon for that matter, and probably silicon. But anyway, there's a political issue, I think, that surrounds phosphorus that isn't necessarily there for nitrogen, or at least it's a different political sphere that these elements operate within. And you know, that's a complicated issue. And so I think my question is, there's a very strong, I guess my position is, there's a very strong biophysical case to consider them together and to consider other nutrients in the same way. But I think I put up questions earlier, you know, what are the barriers to change? Why is there no drivers of change? That was a leading question. I've obviously thought about that a fair bit. And, you know, in my mind, I think the major barrier there is in encouraging countries that you want to consider phosphorus and nitrogen together. And each country will have its own opinion on that for various different reasons. I think that's the challenge, and that I see in terms of implementing sort of international coordination, and that's a dialogue that has to be played out. I don't think we're there yet with that. I mean, others will have their own opinions on that. That's my own opinion. It's a shame that Mark's not here, because I know that he has a very strong opinion on this. Yeah. And so maybe we can ask him this question by email and ask Mark to just write his response to us. That might be useful for you if that was something you'd be interested in. But that's my view. I don't know, Will, if you want to jump in on this.
I mean, you mentioned phosphorus hypersensitivity.
That's fine. Okay, good.
I think in the interest of time, maybe we need to move on.